blended learning was not something born out of the pandemic. It's been around for a really long time. I think the teacher role has to be kind of reimagined for a blended learning environment. I think the same is true for students. It is so much more challenging to be a student in a student-centered learning environment.
The topic for today's podcast is Unpacking Blended Learning, a conversation with Dr. Catlin Tucker. Unpacking Education is brought to you by avid.org. Avid believes in seeing the potential of every student. To learn more about Avid, visit their website at avid.org.
Welcome to Unpacking Education, the podcast where we explore current issues and best practices in education. I'm Rena Clark.
I'm Paul Beckerman.
And I'm Winston Benjamin. We are educators.
And we're here to share insights and actionable strategies.
Education is our passport to the future.
Our quote from today is actually from our guest, Dr. Catlin Tucker. Saw this posted on Twitter, and I thought it was perfect to set up our conversation today. It's from her new book, The Complete Guide to Blended Learning. She writes, "The why, or value behind a shift to blended learning, cannot be a reaction to a moment in time or specific event. That isn't inspiring, and it's unlikely to result in long-term transformation. Instead, the why behind this shift in our approach to teaching and learning should be because it is better for teachers and students." All right, Winston, a lot in there. What sticks out to you?
Don't be stupid. Don't make moves too early. I think one of the things that stands out to me is being proactive, not reactive. And I relate that to my work in multicultural ed in terms of intentionality when you're doing work with students of color, right? You can live in a moment and try to engage with the community and recognize that that might be fleeting in the context of an identity, but being understanding the larger context of how and why it fits in will allow for a better action. So being more aware of what's going on is more important in terms of the long-term sustainability of an action step. So I really appreciate the proactivity in this, the long-term intentionality as an essential part of actions that's long-term and valued for students.
Yeah, and I see it as don't do blended learning because it's the latest fad, right? Do it because it's good for kids, it's good for teachers, it's good for the classrooms, good for learning. I truly believe that, and that's why I'm a proponent of it. But I think it just puts the why out front and center. So we are very excited today to welcome the author of that quote and several books, Dr. Catlin Tucker. She is a best-selling author, international trainer, and keynote speaker. She actually was named Teacher of the Year in 2010 in Sonoma County, where she was a teacher for 16 years. Currently, Catlin is working as a blended learning coach, education consultant, and a professor in the Master of Arts in Teaching program at Pepperdine University. She has written a series of best-selling books on blended learning, which among others includes her new one, The Complete Guide to Blended Learning, as well as Balance with Blended Learning, Power Up Blended Learning, and several others. In fact, I just want to note that my school district in Minnesota, we've leaned heavily on these books and used them for professional learning cohorts around blended learning, supported teachers in their growth with this instructional approach, and teachers have found them really immensely informative and helpful. So with all that, Catlin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So do you want to talk about your quote? Like, why did you put that particular statement in your book?
Yeah, I think in part, I've been supporting teachers in the last 2.5 years through one of the most turbulent times I think we've ever experienced in education. And it was really the first time I think a lot of teachers had heard the phrase blended learning. And unfortunately, because it was thrown into the mix so frequently without clear definitions, without a clear why, and often in a situation where teachers were feeling spread thin and disillusioned and frustrated in general by the situation, it didn't get the best reception. And that just made me sad because I've been in this space since I started working on my first book in 2010. So for me, blended learning truly is I mean, I think in 15 years, we won't be talking about blended learning. It'll just be learning. Like, I don't know how you can be in a society like we are that is so saturated in technology and not figure out how to weave online learning into the physical classroom to enhance a student's experience, period. So I just wanted teachers to know that the why is so much deeper than a reaction to a moment. Blended learning was not something born out of the pandemic. It's been around for a really long time. And I think there's a lot of very compelling whys. Often when I'm talking with school leaders and coaches and teachers, I just highlight these kind of two realities in education that will not change. And you can't say that about a lot of things in ed. But one is learner variability. Like, kids will just always be different from each other in terms of their needs and their skills and their language proficiencies, their backgrounds, their interests. And so as long as we recognize that that's the norm, like, why on earth would we continue to design these single one-size-fits-all experiences for such diverse groups of learners? And second, technology is not going anywhere, right? It's saturated permeated every part of society. It's going to take a shape in the classroom. And I guess what I want is for that technology to be used to shift students to the center of the learning experience, really giving them more control over their experience, as opposed to how I often see technology used in classrooms, which is to isolate learners, which I think is a real missed opportunity.
That's so true. I mean, they're used as, this is a way to keep the student over here kind of quiet and contained so I can work with these students. And there's some part of freeing yourself up to that, but it's not a babysitter. It's a tool for learning. So I'm curious because, we talk about the why should drive things. Some of our listeners may not have that clear definition of what blended learning is, because maybe it is still a misconception from the pandemic learning that we had. So for our listeners who might not be as familiar with it, can you just give us a simple definition of what blended learning is and perhaps an example of what it might look like in the classroom, just to get a context?
Absolutely. So I define blended learning simply as active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline, with the goal of giving students more control over their learning experience, specifically control over these 4 elements of time, place, pace, path. Now, what's really exciting from my perspective, especially coming out kind of the other end of the pandemic, is blended learning is kind of like this umbrella term. And within the umbrella are lots of different models, lots of different ways to combine this active engaged learning online with active engaged learning offline. And so we have station rotation, whole group rotation, playlist model, flipped classroom, and they give students different degrees of control over those 4 elements of their learning. So they're not going to control everything all the time, but the goal truly is to give them more control more of the time. But the models work beautifully in a classroom. So for example, you can have a station rotation where a teacher is leading small group differentiated instruction, giving real-time feedback, facilitating a small group discussion. You could have an online station where students are engaged in online discussion or they're building background through online research. And then you could have an offline station where students are engaged in an offline discussion or they're doing pair practice. Lots of different possibilities, and students rotate through those stations. What was exciting, and the reason I use that particular model, is I think teachers think station equals physical location in a classroom. And when we were entirely online, I was coaching teachers and we were doing virtual station rotations. So they would pull kids into small groups in Zoom or Google Meets. They'd use the breakout room strategically. They'd release kids for asynchronous offline activities. And so just the flexibility of these models, the fact that they can work so well in a physical space, entirely online, and in this kind of hybrid mix of the two, for me, like, that's the flexibility educators need moving forward. Because I think the biggest, most jarring aspect of the pandemic was just like this assumption we need a totally different skill set to teach online as we do in a classroom. And it's not that we need a totally different skill set and tool set, it's we need models that are more flexible.
And I just want to say, Catlin, I really appreciate that flexibility in, it's the strategy. It's like other instructional strategies we have. We take them and we blend them and we match them to the context in which we're teaching. And that's where the power lies in my mind too.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
In your book, Power Up Blended Learning, you point out Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, which many people are familiar with. I know I'm familiar with that, but it encouraged us to start with our why being the big thing. So why blended learning? What is the purpose or value of a shift to blended learning?
I think my why has shifted a lot depending on my role in education. It's kind of morphed. So when I was a teacher just fumbling my way through blended learning, my why was I just want to engage these kids. Like I don't need them all to be academic rock stars, but I want them to want to be here. Like I want them to enjoy being in this class. And so for me, it was trying to figure out how to design learning experiences that piqued their interest and got them kind of engaging with the learning activities. And as I've moved into a coaching role, working with leadership teams, helping schools shift to blended learning, it really has become about acknowledging that we are serving incredibly diverse groups of learners, and a one-size-fits-all teacher-led, teacher-paced model is just not going to be effective to meet that diversity of need. And for me, as I was just saying, like we also need flexibility. We need models that, so many teachers are using that whole group teacher-led model like it's a Swiss Army knife. Like it can solve every problem, address every learning objective. And the reality is it can't. I think that's what the pandemic really highlighted. Teachers took that model, plopped it into Zoom, and kids were like, I'm turning off my camera. I'm out of here. I don't have to engage. I'm not in a physical space where the teacher can make me do anything. And so where I see growth and kind of a real why for teachers in this moment is these models are flexible enough that no matter what the future holds, teachers can feel confident that they can design and facilitate learning experiences to engage learners and to meet that diversity of need in a classroom.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of twofold. It benefits students in meeting their diversity. We have these diverse learners, but it also is benefiting teachers because then they can be flexible within their learning space or whatever they shift towards.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate everyone bringing up the idea that it's like teachers need to think about their role. As you mentioned, Catlin, that you've shifted your understanding of the why as you shift your identity roles, like teacher to admin to counselor or consultant. So one of the questions that I have is like, you talk about the keys to success in blended learning is a shift in teacher mentality or teacher perception of their role from more of a facilitator to a learning partner in the classroom. What might that look like, right? A lot of times people don't know what they don't know. So what might that look like, and what does it take to set up a space like for teacher and student success?
Yeah, so it's actually what I'm encouraging teachers to do is shift from that expert at the front of the room where they spend a lot of time kind of unpacking concepts and transferring information and design learning experiences that let them facilitate learning and truly partner with students, sitting alongside students to really support their individual progress toward firm, standard-aligned goals. And what's interesting is as we shift, so first of all, the reality is you have to spend more time in your design work if you're going to free yourself to be a facilitator, right? So teachers have three main roles in their work. They are expert, right? They have a degree of pedagogical expertise, of subject area expertise. They are also kind of designers or architects of learning experiences. And then they can be these facilitators, these partners with students. And when we don't nurture our design work, right? We don't put a high level of intentionality and time into designing learning experiences that are truly student-centered, then what ends up happening is we are at the front of the room, leading the learning, right? Doing the majority of the work. This is why we're exhausted. This is why the learning isn't super effective from a student perspective. If we invest in our design work, we can free ourselves from that expert at the front of the room and invest time sitting alongside learners, doing things like, running small group differentiated sessions, really meeting specific student needs, giving real-time feedback as students work, conferencing with learners, leading small group interactive modeling sessions to really meet the needs of specific students. And that might mean that sometimes instead of standing up and telling kids everything we know about a topic, we make a series of videos. We let them self-pace through it, so we're free to put our energy somewhere else. Or instead of, kind of guiding a sequence of learning activities, putting together a playlist or a choice board and allowing students to self-pace through activities so we can pull individuals for things like conversations about progress, real-time feedback, troubleshooting issues happening in the classroom. So for me, it's like this really interesting triangle of roles. And when we invest in the design, we have more time for the facilitation, and we don't spend so much time trapped at the front of the room in that expert role, which we know isn't really asking students to be that active agent when we're the ones at the front of the room talking, unpacking, directing, etc.
I appreciate that. Now that makes me think of a follow-up question.
Okay.
And that is in relation to the students doing the cognitive work.
Yep.
So you're asking them, you're shifting that role. So you talk about the importance of the metacognitive skills building that students need in blended learning.
Yep.
What do you mean by that, and why is that important? A lot of times people don't understand the thinking of thinking. What?
Yep.
Why is that important, and how do you support that idea?
So just as I think the teacher role has to be kind of reimagined for a blended learning environment, I think the same is true for students. Like, students are far too comfortable in their role just as passive consumers in a classroom. The most important part of that definition of blended learning that I gave you was active engaged. So it's constantly trying to position the learner, not the teacher, to do the work, do the thinking, reflecting, discussing, making, tinkering, right? All of those pieces, the student has to do it. And, if we're honest, it is so much easier cognitively, socially to be a student in a teacher-centered classroom or learning environment. It is so much more challenging to be a student in a student-centered learning environment. I would argue the payoff is much, much greater. But we also know in blended learning environments, students have to have a higher degree of kind of self-regulation skills. They have to really lean into the learning. And that's where metacognitive skill building, though it won't show up in any of our standards, so sometimes it feels like a big ask to, have teachers prioritize it. It's really critical that students start thinking about their thinking about their learning. And so when I facilitate workshops on metacognition, I always kind of cop to the fact that that's a little abstract. So let's break it down and let's think about it in the before, the during, and the after. So if we're trying to develop students' metacognitive skills, then before we have to do things like get them setting goals for themselves, not goals that a computer program spit out. They don't have any agency over those goals, any ownership over those goals. It's goals they care about. Academic, personal, behavioral. What do they want to work toward? What actions and behaviors are going to carry them toward those things they say they care about? Because even if they're not intrinsically motivated by the subject area or learning in general, when you use goal setting, we can kind of move them down that spectrum of motivation to this place of identified regulation where they start to appreciate, like, the things I'm doing are either taking me closer to things I care about and goals I've set for myself or further away. Getting them planning before they dive into a task or assignment is also something we can do at the beginning, where they think about strategies and resources they can lean on as they navigate a task. During the learning, it's about encouraging kind of an ongoing process of self-assessment. I also am such a huge fan of those thinking routines out of Harvard's Graduate School of Education, getting kids surfacing their thinking, getting comfortable thinking about, how do I feel about this? What am I noticing? What questions do I have? And then at the end of the learning, it's really about a reflective practice. What did I learn? How did I learn it? How might I do this differently next time? What questions do I still have? So as abstract as metacognition can feel, we can really start to operationalize it when we think about it in those three parts, and then start building in really consistent practices. And whether it's a welcome routine where they're setting a goal, whether it's ongoing self-assessment we pull into each station rotation, I think blended learning models can help us create the time and space to allow students to do that metacognitive work, which will then serve them in these environments.
That's so funny. The way when you were describing that, I was like, oh my God, that sounds like the process that I went through when I wrote my PhD.
Oh, yeah.
The constant re-engagement, the conversation with myself. Why does this matter? How do I relate to this? And it sounds like you're asking teachers to assume high ability in students on a graduate level, right? The ability to think for themselves. So I appreciate that push and how you're assessing students' capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only limitations in front of a student are the ones that we're putting there, assuming they can't do things. Because I do hear teachers say, I don't think my students can do that. And I just disagree. I've seen young learners start the process of metacognitive skill building.
Yeah, if you set the goal low, the production will be low. Mm-hmm. You know, kids can do amazing things if we let them, right? So my next question, we talked about the fact that we should move to blended learning if it's better for kids, it's better for learning, better for teachers. And there's two parts of that, right? There's the technical computer online piece, and then there's the human piece. So to make this truly the best, we need to leverage what each of those does best.
Yep.
So what is the best use of the technology, and what is the best use of the humankind piece?
See, this is why I think the transition from expert at the front of the room to facilitator is critical, because what we know technology does well is transfer information. It does it great. What technology does not do well is organically respond to human needs, right? So if we're transferring information, can that happen in a video? Can it happen in a podcast? Can it happen reading an article? Can students choose how they want to engage with and acquire information? So for me, it's like, why would we spend time at the front of the room talking at kids when there are so many barriers in that scenario, whether it is auditory processing, whether a student doesn't feel well, they don't have the background knowledge to understand what you're saying, the vocabulary. It's like, think about all the barriers that exist when we stand there transferring information, and think about how we might remove those barriers by using technology strategically and giving students agency around how they engage with information. And then we're free, because quite frankly, it's exhausting to be at the front of the room telling each class over and over again the same thing. And I have memories of like being in my 9th and 10th grade classroom and having a student in like December ask me what a thesis statement was. And I just wanted to rip out my hair, because I was like, I have said this so many times, but some kids need to hear it over and over and over again. And that's another benefit of technology, right? The technology is not going to be put out if it has to repeat itself over and over again. Humans respond to each other's needs really organically. So it's that human side of teaching that I want teachers to have more time for. Talking with students, asking what they need, responding to those needs with supports and scaffolds and reteach and really targeted instruction and examples. And so that's where I really see the beauty of this kind of blend of online and offline. It's just interesting how many teachers are so reluctant to let go of that teacher at the front of the room, even though tech does it better.
Yep. I love that. Tech does it better. It can repeat over and over again.
Yep.
Well, we talk a lot about relationships on this podcast, and how important relationships are, and building relationships with students and building that classroom community, which is so important when you're thinking about instruction. So in this blended learning environment that you're talking about, how can a teacher build a safe, supportive, and still to have that dynamic learning community?
Yeah, I think what's so interesting embedded in that question is the assumption that it's harder to do in a blended learning environment. And I would argue the exact opposite. So teachers will often talk about, well, I pull kids together and we have discussions and that's how we build community. And I'm like, so more than the same 5 students talk every time? And they're like, well, I do have my discussion dominators. And I'm kind of like, how is that building community, right? I think the more we actually structure learning experiences so that humans can connect in a classroom, which I think is easier to do in all of these models as compared to that teacher at the front of the room kind of approach, that's how you build community, right? It's in students having conversations, wrestling with meaning making, collaborating around shared tasks, not sitting and listening to somebody else talk and working through a series of worksheets, right? So for me, my entire book, The Complete Guide of Blended Learning, is grounded in the community of inquiry theoretical framework, which I always tell teachers, I'm not going to bore you with the theory. I know that's not really why you're here, but it's about building that cognitive presence, the social presence, and the teaching presence in a classroom, and the interplay between those three presences in really creating such a high functioning learning community. So yeah, it's fascinating because I get that question a lot with teachers, which is like, if we move to these models and kids are on technology, they're not going to be, forming relationships. And actually in my own doctoral research, the teachers who taught blended courses and traditional courses almost unanimously said they felt closer to students in their blended courses because of the one-on-one and small group interactions.
Because as you mentioned, if you are a good architect of those learning experiences, then you have more time to sit with those individuals in those small groups and really have time, as you said, to do the human thing, which is react, organically respond, because we're not spending all our energy up in front. So I appreciate that. And I'm just curious, does that look any different in face-to-face versus online spaces, or is it similar?
It kind of depends. So when students are working through like a blended lesson in a physical classroom, hopefully those interactions with the teacher are like small group in a teacher-led station, or maybe students are working through a playlist or choosing items from a choice board and teachers pulling to interact with individual learners. And hopefully if they're really architecting those learning experiences, they're thinking about, how am I fostering communication and collaboration among the members of this learning community if I'm over here doing this thing over, with one kid or a small group of learners. Now, when we're online, I think a lot of that can still happen, in a video conferencing kind of session. You can have teachers interacting with students in shared documents, even giving real-time feedback as they're working, facilitating online discourse. So that opportunity for more human connection, I think, can happen in both spaces. Because as a professor, half the time I'm working with students, it's online because it's a hybrid program. The other half, I'm in class with them. And when I'm online, I'm still focused on that those touch points with learners, so they feel that individual and small group time and attention.
Mm-hmm. I love everything you're saying. And no, I do. And earlier I was thinking that I was like, wow, this sounds like a trauma-informed practice, right? You're engaging with your students. You know what triggers them. You know how to build with them and create spaces for them to be seen and feel seen. And now I'm thinking that even in your book, you describe the UDL, right, and blended learning as a type of ability for teachers to practice equity, right? Not just talk equity, to practice equity. So the question that I have for you is, how can blended learning improve or help teachers be more intentional in proving equity in their classroom?
Oh my gosh. The thing that is so fascinating about conversations about equity is all educators are like, yes, equity in education is a top priority. Yet, when you are still designing a single experience for all learners, that is not equitable. What we need to be thinking about and acknowledging in our design work is different learners just need different inputs to get to a particular output. So we need to design learning experiences that allow for that allow us to give learners what they specifically need. And I just think it's impossible to do in these kind of one-size-fits-all lessons. And when I started to kind of really explore the intersection of universal design for learning, like how do we make sure learning is accessible and inclusive and equitable, and blended learning, it's not that blended learning is necessarily going to always produce those results. I think when you bring them together and you start to intentionally think about universally designing blended learning, it becomes about acknowledging that all students are capable of reaching those firm, standard-aligned goals, but the pathways they take to get there are just going to be different. And the amount of teacher time and energy resources they're going to need is different. So how are we designing learning experiences to free us to make sure we understand what individual learners need and can give them what they need so they're all experiencing success?
I'm thinking about another piece that you had in your book, Balance with Blended Learning. I think that book really resonates with teachers because you talk about the topic of workload and work-life balance, and that's so forefront on a lot of teachers' minds, as they struggle through those things. And it improves the classroom experience too if you can reduce those. So you put forth a convincing case that blended learning can be a win-win approach to this. How would you describe teachers rethinking maybe grading and feedback in a blended learning classroom to both improve communication, but also maybe reduce that workload?
Yeah, so I start that book just by acknowledging that in the start of my own career, I was basically like the Oprah Winfrey of points. Like, you get points for this and you get points for that. Oh, you brought your SSR point. You get points for your SSR book or your annotations or whatever. And it was like, I was drowning in grading, and it wasn't grading that was really benefiting anybody. It was like, are you complying? Are you jumping through the hoops? Now I have 100 grades at the semester for every class. And I think it was really when I started to question, like, what am I grading and why am I grading this? And how do I create a culture in this classroom where I don't have to use grades as this carrot to make kids do things, right? Instead, I want them to understand the inherent value of what we're doing. I want them to see and appreciate their growth so they understand why they're here and why this is important work. And so in that book, it was really about my starting to rethink my approach, first to grading and then kind of everything. So for example, I wish I could say my flip in kind of feedback and grading was some progressive, like forward thinking thing. It wasn't. I was just drowning. So I ended up creating this flow chart where I would ask the question, like, what is the purpose of this work? And if the answer was, this is review and practice, I was like, I'm not going to grade it. I'm not giving feedback on it. Instead, students will engage in self-assessment. I'll give them an answer key, let them pair up, work on their own, figure out, what did I get correct? What did I miss? Can I work with a partner to figure out why I missed this? If we really can't figure it out together, we're going to tell Tucker, we need to spend some time on this because we couldn't figure it out. So then in that scenario, it's okay to make mistakes when they're practicing and reviewing. They're the ones thinking critically about their learning and their work and what's revealing about their skill set and content knowledge. Now, if the answer to that question was the purpose of work is work toward a finished product. So usually for me as an English teacher, that was a piece of writing. For another teacher, a math teacher, it might be a performance task or a project of some kind. The focus was on feedback, no grade. So I would run a station rotation. I would use my teacher-led station to give focused, actionable feedback. I couldn't fix everything. That was really hard for me to accept at first because I was used to correcting every wonky sentence, every missing comma. And instead it was like, today in the feedback session, I'm looking at your thesis, or I'm looking at your topic sentence or your evidence. That's it. And I would give them feedback they could take and act on to improve that piece before they ever turned anything in to be assessed. And I had so many students say, I've never gotten feedback like this. I've never felt like I really knew what I was doing when I was completing assignments. Like, thank you. So for me, it was like a win-win. They felt seen, they felt supported, and I was not taking feedback home anymore. And I could not have been happier about that. And then if the answer to the question was, this is a finished product or an assessment, then they got a grade. They did not get additional feedback. And I always grade with a standard aligned rubric. So I'm circling language on the rubric. So technically they're getting some feedback. But if they wanted to keep working with that piece to kind of revamp and improve it, then they could request feedback. And now, because I'm not grading everything under the sun, I had the bandwidth to say, sure, you want to keep working on this? Can I reinforce your growth mindset and give you feedback that then you're going to take to continue making this better? Absolutely. So for me, it was really about kind of reimagining some of these approaches and workflows and starting to see that feedback and even assessment. Because if I was going to assess something, I would try to do it with the student sitting next to me. So the class might be working through a rotation where I wasn't leading a station. They might be working through a playlist or a choice board or kind of an exploration activity or a scavenger hunt. And I'd be pulling individual kids for great conversations. And I realized the best way to improve our relationships with learners is not a bunch of like additional community building activities. It's giving them feedback as they work. It's sitting next to them and grading so they understand why they're getting the grades they're getting. It's running regular conferencing sessions about their progress. So for me, that was all transformative. And I just don't know that you can do those things in a traditional classroom, which is why I was like, hey, let's use blended learning to find more balance in this profession and take some of these really time-consuming workflows and shift them into the classroom as opportunities to build relationships with learners.
I'm curious too, as you were doing that switch, did you see the performances improve?
Oh my gosh, unbelievable. Because really the first before side-by-side assessments was the feedback shift. And all of a sudden it was like, we would be working on an essay. Often that took like a week and a half from beginning to end. And like a student would sit at my teacher-led station. They knew that day I was giving feedback on some aspect of an introduction. Boom, they hadn't even started it. Instead of waiting a week and a half to realize a third of the class had never even started the writing assignment, I was like, oh, you didn't do your introduction. Open up your computer, email your parent or caregiver, CC me, explain where you should be, where you are, what your action plan for catching up is, and then start writing. So it was like, I always knew where every single student was in the process. I knew who needed more support. Parents were informed about kids who were falling behind. So it was like, I had such a better sense of where my students are. And there were kids who had never, their own admission, never written an essay before in their entire lives. I'm not going to say their essays were great, but they turned in essays for me because there was no hiding from the fact that they were supposed to be doing this work and they were going to be sitting with me for these feedback sessions every day through this process.
Something that I so appreciated what you just described is that being more equitable to your students literally lowers your workload. Don't be stupid and grade a lot of things for no reason. Don't give extra for no reason that's not going to relate to the quality of what you want students to learn. And give yourself some breather space.
Yes.
Win-win.
Because if you're not taking all that home, then guess what we have time for? Our design work.
Which is that being that architect, and also thinking you're providing feedback, I think, need to need, in person. I mean, I think I never like reading papers that have squiggly lines. That's not going to inform my next steps. So I just appreciate that. And that works as I work with the littles. You see this happening in kindergarten classroom. It works. It works with the littles. It works with, I mean, even with in grad school, it works at all levels. Mm-hmm. So you talked about this a little bit earlier. I'm just going to jump in. But in your book, The Complete Guide to Blended Learning, you talked about the 3 elements of the COI framework. So you talked about teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. Could you just touch a little bit more and go a little deeper why each is so important within the blended learning environment and how that really supports and builds community and inquiry?
Absolutely. So much of the research on blended and online learning is anchored in the community of inquiry framework, which is why I use it. The teaching presence really is kind of the glue in the research that holds the social presence, the cognitive presence together. And it's that teaching presence that gives us the insight into those main teacher roles as kind of expert instructor, facilitator, designer. And so I really get into those different roles through the lens of blended learning in the book. And then social presence is really the student's ability to project their social and emotional selves in a classroom and online. Particularly for the online component, it's that desire to make sure that they really recognize each other as like actual humans online when they're interacting. And I use the Castle framework to really talk about how we can integrate social emotional learning to develop a social presence. Because part of my concern as well during the pandemic is I appreciated the focus on SEL. I thought that this is so important. These kids are coming to school online in person with a lot of trauma. They've been through so much social isolation. But it almost felt like SEL, I mean, I'm talking from experience with my own 2 children. It was like they had an SEL 30-minute block a couple times a week. So it was like this disjointed other thing. And my kind of position in the book, exactly, it kind of like checking a box, right? My position in the book is let's use these core competencies of social emotional learning. Thank you, Castle, for like laying those out for us. And let's figure out how to integrate them into the fabric of our classes to really develop these skills. So students have the social awareness and the social, like the ability to self-manage and responsible decision-making so that they really can interact with each other in these healthy and productive, supportive ways. And then the cognitive presence is really grounded in an inquiry cycle. So too often, unfortunately, in classrooms, students are given answers to, questions they didn't ask, solutions to problems they've never encountered. And that means learning doesn't feel super relevant. Whereas when we think about the cognitive presence, it's like, where are those moments where students hit a triggering event? Something that like piques their interest, where they ask a question. Do they ever have the space to then explore and then test their ideas out against the community? So I actually talk about the 5 E's instructional model in that section, because even though it's not under the original taxonomy of blended learning models, I think the 5 E's is phenomenal for structuring inquiry across grade levels, across subject areas, and you can really blend this beautiful kind of combination of online learning and exploration and dialogue with in-person interaction in a way that really sets inquiry up to position student as that active agent.
And just for our listeners, because I think I'm familiar with the 5 E's, but would you mind just sharing exactly a little bit more about what the 5 E's are?
Yeah, so I feel like it was Ryan Bybee. I'm trying to remember exactly what his last name was, but it was developed for sciences, right? It was an approach to inquiry in the sciences. And it's really starts with an engage. It shifts students into explore. Then there's an explain, elaborate, and evaluate. So the idea is we kind of like pique their interest. We might assess prior knowledge. Hopefully we're getting them excited about the inquiry, kind of that triggering piece. Then we get them into exploration, where they might be having interviews with grandparents, collecting field work, going online to do research. Then they go to the explain, where they're kind of testing what they think they learned out against the community, kind of interacting with each other. The elaborate is really like, how are we taking what they learned and kind of like extending it? How are they going to kind of take what they learned and do something meaningful? And then you end with the evaluate. And when I was working with teachers during the pandemic, when they were entirely online, the 5 E's was one of the most effective ways to kind of position students online to really drive their own learning in really meaningful ways that blended that online and offline piece. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted by how well it worked across grade levels and subject areas. Like, I was working with kinder teachers who were creating 5 inquiries. I was working with 12th grade econ teachers doing the same thing. And it was just really exciting. Again, it's that flexibility that I am so drawn to.
And I know the 5E model is actually at Avid what we use to help create kind of our STEM connections. So
nice.
We use that model.
So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking and I'm listening and I'm here like, oh my God, it sounds like you have been informed by tons of people.
Oh, yeah.
You've been informed by the teachers in the classroom, by students, by your coworkers. But in your new book, you kind of share an insight you gained while doing your doctoral research. And you mentioned that the practicing teachers that you were working with pointed out that there are 3 key benefits of blended learning. They said these are student agency, differentiation, and control over pace.
Yes.
Right. Can you give us a little bit of explanation? Let's say, can you elaborate? Just a little bit on why those are important and how can teachers actualize these benefits.
Yeah, so I almost talk about them now as like what I would consider pillars of high quality blended learning, right? So when I'm working with teachers, particularly if I come into a district or a group where it's like an all staff training, they did not opt in, they have to be with me. They're a little leery of blended learning probably because it's going to take time. It's going to take energy. And what teachers don't have a lot of is time and probably excess energy because this job is just intense. So the way I frame those three kind of pillars of high quality blended learning is like, here's a teacher pain point this can address, and here's the benefit for learners. So first is student agency, which is giving students meaningful choices in their learning experience. And the pain point that really can address, and I hear from teachers all the time, is their perception that students are not engaged and they're not motivated, right? And that's really frustrating because teacher engagement and student engagement are reciprocal. So when teacher engagement dips or student engagement dips, it has a negative impact on the other. If student engagement goes up, it has a positive impact on teacher engagement. So if we think about what we know about human motivation, people need actually autonomy and agency to be really motivated. So if we as teachers are feeling frustrated that students don't seem motivated in our classrooms, the last thing we want to do is tighten that grip of control, which is so tempting, right? Like I'm just going to force them to do what I want them to do. And actually what we want to do is release some control and give them more agency and more autonomy in their learning. And that can surface in a couple different ways. It doesn't mean students get to control everything all the time, but where are those moments where we might give them control over the what or the content, right? Because we cover these just enormous umbrella topics in our classes. Can we sometimes let them choose the lens they want to look through as they approach an assignment or learn about a topic? Or maybe some process decisions around how they do something, what materials they use, what steps they move through, whether they do it online or offline, or even the products they create to demonstrate their learning. Like, where are we intentionally thinking about that? Because that's also a way to remove barriers, right? If we're giving them meaningful options and choices, we're allowing them to choose the pathway that is going to work for them. The second is that piece around being able to more consistently and effectively differentiate. And the teacher pain point that speaks to is just how daunting it is as a single person to try to meet the diversity of need in a classroom. And what I know from being in education for over 20 years is the spectrum of need in classrooms just continues to get wider and wider and wider. And so if teachers want to be effective meeting students where they're at, differentiated instruction, really thinking about what scaffolds and supports might certain learners need to be successful, what level of academic rigor and complexity are they ready for, then that's much easier to do if we're not marching a group of 30, 35 kids through a single experience, but we're using these different models to work with small groups or individual students. And then third is that control over pace. And the teacher pain point that can help to address is just frustration around unproductive behaviors in classroom management. Last year took the cake when it came to classroom management issues, right? Kids were reacclimating to this academic setting. It was really rough because they had lost all of this autonomy they had enjoyed in their home environments. And so when we give them more control over the pace, what ends up happening is that a lot of the unproductive behaviors that blossom from that misalignment between the pace at which the learning is moving and the pace at which the learner needs it to move, they start to it mitigates a lot of that. So where is it, as we're thinking about designing these learning experiences, where we can give students more control over the pace at which they consume and process information or navigate multi-step tasks? Because then we don't have kids who are frustrated because it's going too quickly and kind of giving up and getting angry. We don't have kids who are bored and making their own fun because there's always somewhere else they can go.
Thank you.
I love that idea of identifying the pain point and then working out from there. That is a great way to motivate teachers to get engaged in that conversation, because there's an immediate benefit and it's so relevant. Yeah. Same thing with kids, right?
Yeah, and it's a tough profession. So we want to be doing things that make it more doable and manageable and enjoyable.
Right. If we have more time to engage with kids, that's what most of us got into it for. You know, we want to work one-on-one with those kids. So I have one more question for you before we jump into our toolkit section. And so if a teacher's listening to this podcast and they haven't really engaged in blended learning, but they like kind of what they're hearing and they want to maybe start this shift toward blended learning, what kind of advice would you give them?
It's the same advice I give everyone. So I'll start with the basic, which is get excited, think big, start small, right? Like choose one model, choose one strategy. Yes, agency, differentiation, control over pace, those are definitely pillars of high quality blended learning. Do they need to show up in your first lesson, your first 2 or 3 lessons? No. If you're just acclimating to a station rotation or you're doing a playlist for the first time, just like give yourself some space to make mistakes and flounder a little bit. I think one thing that's hard is when you've been teaching for a while and you try something new, you're back in the seat of a first-year teacher, right? It's not going to go smoothly, and that's okay. And that brings me to my second piece of advice, which is as educators, we need to see ourselves as the lead learner in a classroom. That means we're experimenting. That means we're hitting bumps. That means we fail sometimes. And I think the more willing we are to be vulnerable and be that lead learner, the less scary it is for students in classrooms to take risks and potentially fail.
There's I wonder if there's another piece of that too. I remember working with a secondary teacher who was introducing station rotation in her English classroom at the high school. And she said, I just assumed kids could do it.
Oh, no.
And she's like, I realized very quickly I need to teach the kids how to function in this new environment because they're just used to sitting back in their chair, listening and taking notes.
Absolutely.
Because, as we mentioned earlier, it's more energy and work when they...
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. When they're
Although I will say that teacher should not feel bad because I think I was at the time half-time teaching and half-time coaching. So I had a few years of blended learning experience under my belt. And on my B day, I was a coach and I went into a 3rd grade classroom and I watched this 3rd grade group of students transition, the first transition in their station rotation, and my jaw just about hit the floor. It was the most efficient transition I had ever seen. And I remember asking the teacher, who I'm coaching, hey, can I record them the next time they transition? And he was like, sure. So I get out my iPhone and I'm like recording them as they're transitioning. I go back to my high school class. The next day we were doing a rotation. And I said, before we start, you got to see something. I showed them the video of the 3rd graders transitioning. And I was like, this is what you're working toward. And I was like, I dropped the ball. Like I didn't do a great job of having a clear transition strategy and making them practice. Cause I was like, oh, they can almost drive a car. They can transition. Nope. They needed to be trained.
That's the exact same realization this teacher, and she's a good teacher, and she just said, all right, class, we need to talk. Right. And they just said, if we're going to make this work, this is what we need to do. And she asked them too, what do we need to do to make this work?
And some of the things that I'm hearing you say about your own admittance of flaws, right? Like that's a very powerful thing to recognize that you are the hindrance toward your student success.
Yep.
Like that's a hard thing to sell as a teacher, to actually admit that. And I appreciate that shift to help students be better. That's a very powerful place to be in.
And that shift to lead learner can be difficult for some. And so it's putting yourself out there and taking that risk and that chance. But to help all those teachers that are interested, we're going to transition into our toolkit and provide some tools that might help you with your journey into blended learning.
Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. What's in the toolkit? What is in the toolkit? What's in the toolkit? Check it out.
So Winston, what's in your toolkit?
I'm not going to slam my hand on the table right now because my mic's on the table. I'm traveling. I'm in Houston right now. But I'm going to go back to an original point about, teachers, pre-plan. If you pre-plan, you'll have more time for flexibility in the end, and you'll have more time for yourself. right? Being careful about why and how you're doing stuff and thinking actively about how to do it will help you in the end, which will help students in the end. So I think that was a very important tool to add to my toolkit.
I'm going to extend on your tool because it's not, I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding around what pre-planning consists of. Like pre-planning might, what is the concept? So we're thinking about that pedagogy, but really that moving into investing into that, I love the word architecture, but investing in the design. And even as we were just talking about, thinking about transitions, spaces, are we going to do playlists? Are we going to do station rotation so that you have more time for facilitation? And I love the idea of when I coach and work with educators, it is, I care about students. I want to work with students. You will have more time to connect and truly get to know your students if you invest in that design and not just the pedagogy, but the architect of design.
No, it's hard to narrow it down because I've heard so many actionable things in this conversation already today. The one that really sticks in my head is providing feedback in class. Get face-to-face with those kids, talk to them, have a real conversation, provide that feedback in class. And on maybe a planning practical thing, if you're thinking of maybe doing a playlist formula or a playlist approach, there are templates out there galore. I know we've got some on avidopenaccess.org. You can go check those out. Find a template that you like and don't start from scratch. Use that as sort of your structure to give yourself a little bit of a scaffold. How about you, Catlin? Do you want to drop something in our toolkit?
Oh my gosh.
Something that teachers could use, like a strategy or a thought or an approach or an actual tool or whatever.
Well, I think I love the recommendation to use templates that are out there. Like, I think they serve as scaffolds for teachers when they're planning. So whether it's, a template for a station rotation or a playlist model or a choice board, like I even remember, I would encourage you not only lean on those templates as scaffolds, but if you're on any social media channel, reach out to people. Because I remember posting a request for example elementary choice boards before I was going into a training with young elementary teachers, and I just didn't have as many examples as I would have liked. So I did this call out on Twitter and I just said, hey, elementary teachers, does anybody have a great choice board they don't mind sharing so I can use it as an example? I got 140 different replies, and most of those people linked to choice boards. So, we all hear in credential teacher education programs, don't reinvent the wheel, but I think sometimes we just forget to ask what's out there. And so really connecting with people, because it's not just people on your campus, there are incredible people all over doing cool stuff, and educators are some of the most generous people out there. So don't be afraid to ask as you're starting this kind of new blended learning journey. There's a lot of people out there who, they've been spending some time in this space and they're willing to share their ideas.
For sure. I'm going to prompt one more toolkit item, and that's your books, Catlin, because I really think that they're awesome. You want to just talk a minute about your new book? Just, a plug for that. What's in it? What's kind of the focus?
Yeah. So the new book was this really interesting moment where, I had written a book in 2010, 2011 that was kind of like my first book, where honestly, like Winston was saying, I was just fumbling my way through this space, making one mistake after another and learning from it. And then I got this chance to kind of write the complete guide after 12 years, right? As a teacher, a blended learning coach, a professor, and my doctoral work, just pulling it all together so that a teacher who's just getting started, or even somebody who's kind of been on this journey for a while, but knows there's room to grow, has everything they need to be successful, not just in their practice designing learning experiences and architecting those student-centered kind of experiences where kids are making the meaning, but also really thinking about nurturing that social presence and really helping students connect with each other and form that cohesive bond as a learning community, and then driving inquiry so kids have that flexibility to pursue things that are interesting to them. So for me, it was really this exciting moment of pulling the last 12 years of experience together in a way that I couldn't have done earlier in my own blended learning journey. So it's a great resource. I'm really proud of it.
Awesome. And what's the title and where can people get it?
It's called The Complete Guide to Blended Learning, and then it has a whole subtitle about activating agency and community and differentiation, all that stuff. But you can get it on Amazon, you can get it at Solution Tree, so not hard to find.
Thank you so much. Because of that, you've given us a lot of things to think about. I'm going to ask the group to think about one thing. What's the one thing that's still in your mind that you're holding on to as we move on to the end of this conversation?
It's time for that one thing.
One thing.
One thing. It's time for that one thing.
It's that one thing.
Rena or Paul, where are you thinking?
There are so many things, and I might fangirl a little because, Catlin, I love your books. I've learned so much from you, and I'm just excited to talk to you. But one thing you said today that I just resonates with me and all the work I'm doing with teachers right now is this idea of designing a single experience for all students is not equitable. So if that is truly a core value, then we need to show that in our practices.
Paul?
And what keeps coming back to me with almost everything that we talk about in here is a student ownership piece. We need to give students ownership in that learning process, because if the teacher's the one doing all the work, they're the ones that are learning it,
Yep.
and the students are just kind of passively coasting along with us. We need to engage those students as the lead learner in the classroom, really switch lead learner from me to you, to that student. And I just think that's key. You talked about at one point, autonomy plus engagement equals motivation or something like that. I mean, that's a really interesting way to think about it. If we want our kids to be motivated, give them autonomy, make sure they're engaged, give them choice. That really sticks with me.
I appreciate that. Something that I'm walking away with and still mulling over is, I know teachers are afraid of technology because of the last couple of years. I know it's not where we want to go back into. I know that's not the thing. But using technology in your class effectively, because you've planned it, gives you more time to focus on the humanity of teaching. I just really want to reiterate that it gives you the chance to focus on the humanity of teaching, right? So spend the time in using your time wisely so you are able to see and love your kids.
Powerful. Catlin, what's your one thing you can leave our listeners with here as we end our conversation today?
I think it's funny. I was reading, I think it was Daring Greatly. Like I am a big fan of Brene Brown, and I was reading this excerpt where she was talking about living this wholehearted life and how important, compassion and connection and like these big things that like are so critical to living this kind of wholehearted existence. And I read everything through the lens of being an educator. And I just thought, like, if we are going to be really the most effective humans we can be in this profession, which is so incredibly important because we're touching all of these lives and having such a big impact, even if we don't see it in the moment, it's like, can we be courageous enough to take risks, try things that are new, step outside of our comfort zone? Can we have compassion for ourselves and our students as we're trying these new things and it's not going to go super well? And are we always designing for coming into classes really focused on connection? So it's like that courage, compassion, connection. I just want teachers to be thinking about how important those things are as we do this really important work.
Awesome. As we wrap up our time together, Catlin, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We consider you to be an important thought leader and practitioner in the area of blended learning. I know personally your work has shaped my teaching and the teachers that I've worked with for the better, and I really believe our listeners will find benefit as well. Thanks so much for sharing some of your work and insights with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Education.
We invite you to visit us at avidopenaccess.org, where you can discover resources to support student agency, equity, and academic tenacity to create a classroom for future-ready learners.
We'll be back here next Wednesday for a fresh episode of Unpacking Education.
And remember, go forth and be awesome.
Thank you for all you do.
You make a difference.